So our topic today is proteins. If you look on the board, I wrote proteins and enzymes, but enzymes are just a thing that proteins do. And so really, we're going to talk about proteins for the next few days. Proteins are made out of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, which is the same thing that fats and carbohydrates are made out of. But there is one big distinctive thing that is different. Proteins have nitrogen in them. And so if I were to show you a picture of something and ask you, what is this? And you saw that there was nitrogen in it, that is your number one clue that you are looking at a protein. Now together, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen link together to make an amino acid. So the first picture that's in your textbook that I've also illustrated up here is a picture of what an amino acid looks like. Now there are actually 20 different amino acids that I would not expect for you to memorize nor recognize. But just so that you know, all amino acids, these are like the subunits of proteins. So it takes a whole bunch of amino acids to make up one protein. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and so very similarly to how the order of molecules is what makes your DNA unique, the order of amino acids is what makes one protein different from the next. Now if we look at the amino acid structure down here, what I'd like for you to notice very specifically is this side right here. That's the amino side. Amino is referring to the nitrogen that is there. And so if I were to ask you to identify from a picture an amino acid, I would probably show you a diagram like this. You would look to see if there was an N somewhere, and if there were, you would probably say, aha, amino acid. Now one of them all by itself is an amino acid. A whole bunch of them put together is how you get a protein. So on the right, and this is the picture that's very similar to page 211 of your textbook, I'm illustrating to you how I make a bond between two amino acids. So the word here is peptide bond, and that's the name we give a bond between two amino acids. Just as a side note, if you see pep at the beginning of a word in biology, it most definitely has to do with a protein, somehow, somewhere, somehow. Now a peptide bond is simply something that you would get if you went through dehydration synthesis. So just like any other macromolecule, just like a fat, just like a carbohydrate, if I would like to attach two amino acids together, I will locate a spot on the molecule where there are two hydrogens and an oxygen that I could take away. Notice how I don't care what the rest of the molecule looks like. I wouldn't expect you to memorize that or draw it from scratch. What I do care is that you recognize that I'm going to take a hydrogen from this molecule on the right, and an oxygen and a hydrogen from the one on the left. That's going to become my molecule of water. So anytime I want to put two small pieces together, I need to remove a molecule of water, and wherever those atoms were, that's where my two pieces will be joined. In the end, I have a molecule of water kicking around on the side, and now my two amino acids have joined together in one structure. So again, it is not the details of molecular structure that I want you to focus on, but the process. The idea that if I would like to put two small pieces together, I need to find 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, take them out, and wherever I took them out, that's where my 2 subunits will be joined. Now, before we talk about anything else about proteins, does anyone have any lingering questions about dehydration synthesis or its opposite, hydrolysis? I'll just repeat this then. I wouldn't ask you to draw this from scratch. If I wanted to ask you something about one of those processes, I would give you an illustration that already existed and just ask you to show me perhaps where this would happen, so you don't have to memorize detailed molecular structures. Does anyone still need this screen to be visible? Because they're writing down some of the words that are there. Don't forget, pictures are in your textbook if you need to refer to them. So, we are going to talk about 6 different functions that proteins have. And if we're lucky, the internet will allow us to watch just a few little video clips of proteins actually doing these things. The first function of proteins that interests us is that proteins are enzymes, and this is the one that we're going to focus on for now. In other units, we will focus more on some of the other functions of proteins, but for now, we're going to focus on enzymes. Now, enzymes are actually just big globular proteins. So they're big, sort of roundish looking proteins, and their function is to speed up chemical reactions. And so I'm going to show you, using an example of an enzyme that you have in your own mouth, how an enzyme would make a chemical reaction happen faster. So I will bring this screen back so that you can keep writing things, but what I'd like to do is show you this amylase reaction. So if I take a look, amylase is an enzyme, and this is a really simplified picture of what amylase looks like. So it's a big globular thing, and if you look, it kind of looks like there's a channel, sort of like it's the Death Star and I'm going to ride in the little trench and blow the whole thing up. That's what it has on it. That is the spot that we focus on. You'll see that it's called the active site because that's where something is going to happen. So this is what amylase looks like. The substrate, the thing that amylase is going to help have a reaction, is a molecule of starch. It's actually a whole bunch of glucose molecules put together. So if you look, remember that glucose or any other sugar usually has that sort of hexagon shape as its base. And so you can recognize that that must be a carbohydrate. So amylase is going to help starch perform a chemical reaction. Now I'll show you, first of all, the less detailed view that kind of shows you overall what's happening. You'll see that the substrate and the enzyme meet up, and when they do, the substrate is broken apart. And so this enzyme, amylase, is helping break apart the long chain of glucose molecules to make much smaller pieces, and that helps with digestion. Now, if we go close up, you'll see that in this spot that I pointed out, that's the active site, that's where something is actually happening. And what amylase is specifically doing is making it easier for water and starch to join, because you need water to perform hydrolysis. So amylase isn't actually part of the reaction. Its molecular shape is not changing. It's the spot. It's like the hookup point or meeting place. Used to be you drive to somewhere in your car, but I don't think people do that anymore. That's what amylase is for starch and for water. It's the spot that they meet so that their reaction can happen more easily. So the amylase is like the matchmaker. It allows the water molecule to come in, and you'll see right here, is the H and O from the water molecule. It came in and split apart the molecule of starch. So, this helps us review hydrolysis, but also shows you what an enzyme does. It makes a reaction happen faster because it facilitates it. It doesn't actually participate. That reaction could happen without amylase. It just happens faster if amylase is there. Now, if we go back, another function of proteins is that they can act as hormones. Whoops. Now, some hormones are not made out of proteins, so this isn't an exclusive thing. Some of your hormones are made out of lipids as well, so that would be another thing that fats can be a part of. But a good example of a protein hormone would be insulin. And I used insulin as an example because in a later chapter, when we talk about digestion and blood sugar, we will mention the function of insulin. Now, I checked this video this morning, and the video that I had been using was broken, so I'm going to find a better one. Maybe we'll talk about when we talk about digestion. Does anyone know what insulin does? Just on the side, as a side note, yeah? Right, so pancreas makes insulin, and insulin is the thing that takes sugar out of your blood and puts it in storage. There's another hormone that does the opposite of it, but the reason that someone would need, let's say, an insulin injection is because their blood sugar gets so high that it could cause them to pass out, have a heart attack, all sorts of crazy things. The third function of proteins that interests us is that they can be antibodies. Antibodies are something we'll discuss quite specifically when we do chapter 8, when we talk about your blood, because antibodies are proteins that help in defense against foreign substances. So if I were to write the word immunity, that's what an antibody is helping you do. So antibodies are like the little soldiers that stick to foreign molecules and alert you, hey, this thing isn't supposed to be here. So I do have a little clip about antigen function. We'll see if this one works. That's interesting. Let's have some sound.
Each type of antibody binds to one.
Here, we'll go back to the beginning so that you can see it. So this is just a little brief picture of what an antibody does, just so that you have an idea of what the protein is actually doing. We'll make it big.
Antibodies are proteins that play an integral role in the complex system of specific immunity. They bind to and inactivate foreign proteins called antigens. Each type of antibody binds to one kind of antigen molecule. B cells are one of the two types of white blood cells that make antibodies. When a bacterial cell enters the bloodstream, proteins on its surface act as antigens and trigger response by the immune system. These antigens will bind to the unique B cells that have the corresponding antibodies on their surfaces. These B cells now divide. Some continue to divide, producing many plasma cells. Plasma cells secrete large quantities.
That's the end of the part that really would interest us here. Now, I showed you this now, and I'm actually going to show you that same video clip later on when we come back to immunity, but the idea is that that's a different thing that a protein can do. It doesn't have to facilitate a reaction. It can be sort of like a trigger to help your body respond to foreign substances. So if we return here, other things that proteins can do, and they do a lot of this, is they can act as something structural. A structural protein is something that, the way the name sounds, is making up the actual structure of something. So there are proteins in tendons, in cartilage, in collagen, in keratin, so in your nails, in your hair, in your skin. Anything that needs some structural support probably has some protein molecules in it. Collagen, as an aside, collagen is a protein that's under your skin. It's what women get injected into their lips often to make them look poofier. I would say dumber, but poofier. Keratin is something that you would find in hair and nails. And if you look at shampoo sometimes, they'll talk about how there's keratin in it. Another function, and in fact the last two functions of proteins are actually quite similar. They're both talking about transportation, but it's in two different locations. Proteins can act as transporters through the cell membrane. So that would be one place where proteins facilitate transport. So hopefully you learned at some point in your life that things can get in and out of cells, and that sometimes a protein opens up a little door, opens up a little channel, and lets things through. That's what we're referring to here. So I have a little clip to illustrate that, just in case you have forgotten. Okay, I don't have a clip about that. The other thing that proteins can do is they can act as carriers. And so it's still in the transport category, but in this case, the protein itself is moving. In the first example, the protein is simply part of the cell membrane, and it's like a door. It opens up and lets things through. A carrier protein would be something that picks up a substance and moves it to another location in the organism. For example, hemoglobin. Does anybody know what hemoglobin is? Where it is? What it does? Hemoglobin is what's in your blood. You all have it. If you didn't have it, you'd be dead. Hemoglobin is what helps you transport oxygen and, on the flip side, carbon dioxide between the cells in your body so you can breathe. And so just to show you briefly what hemoglobin does, I have a little clip, crossing our fingers. Oh, jeez, that was loud. Whew. You never know what kind of ad you're going to get. Oh yeah, that's right. This one didn't have sound on it anyways. So hemoglobin is part of your red blood cells. In your red blood cells, there we go, you have a big protein, and you notice there's a bunch of different sections to it. That's your hemoglobin. There's 4 little subunits that are part of it. Most proteins that are large are like that. They actually have a few different chains of amino acid. Because there are 4 sections, there are 4 spots where oxygen molecules can possibly attach themselves to hemoglobin. And once they do that, and the hemoglobin molecule moves around, that's how we could carry oxygen from one cell to another. All right, so those are the 6 functions of proteins. We are going to be really specific about enzymes, but for the other functions, if you could briefly describe it or give me an example of it, that would be all that I would ask you to do at this point. So with the exception of enzymes, for the rest of them on there, could you give me an example of a protein hormone? Could you give me an example of a structural protein? That's the kind of thing I would expect at this point. Does anyone want to ask any questions about the functions of proteins? So I'm just going to pause for a second.